So thanks. So I'm Damian Grimshaw, Professor of Employment Studies at the Business School, where we have a research centre that looks mainly at European work employment research, actually, but with increasing focus on trying to do something locally. Matt's talked a great deal about the sort of structuring of the labour market. So we don't come at this from a sort of an economics perspective where we see skills and productivity matching with pay. We sort of reject that approach. And we're much more interested in the way labour markets are structured. And many of the organisations in the room are sort of organisations and intermediaries in that structuring, which explains various processes as well as inequalities that we see. Now, one of the sort of headline results, of course, that we all watch is what happens to pay. We know that in Greater Manchester, pay levels are lower than London. But I have to say I was quite surprised to see how much lower they were than the UK average. I always thought of the Northwest and Greater Manchester as a region that sort of embodied the sort of average mix of the mixed economy of the country. And I think that is borne out if you look at the sector composition and the occupational composition. But when it comes to salaries, we're way below the UK averages. So it turns out that, in fact, the gap, or if you like, the penalty, hits men in full-time jobs much more than women in full-time jobs. I'll say something about part-time jobs in a moment, but I just want to use this data to talk about the annual salaries, because I think that's something we can identify with. You can see that the gap for male full-time employees is close to £3,000, for women, 1,400 for Greater Manchester. And that gap really widens up in some of the local authorities within Greater Manchester. So Thameside and Bolton, there for the data we've got from the Office for National Statistics, you see the lowest earnings opportunities. So this is based on resident data. So residents of those local authorities who take full-time jobs, they're quite significant gaps. So that's around £5,000 gap on the annual salary for men in full-time jobs, and it's around £3,500 for women in the Thameside local authority. Sorry, I should have said here, Trafford stands out as it's sort of a recurring theme, isn't it, in all the different presentations. And it does stand out with having high salary opportunities, but it also stands out as being having the highest gender pay gap. Now, across the country, for full-time employees, and I stress full-time only, the gap for the UK is around 19%. But in Trafford, you see it's 24%. So the high salaries seem to come at a price, which is sort of borne out by the general pay data, that the higher up the pay scale you go, the wider the inequalities across a whole slew of inequalities. You tend to see less inequalities in the lower paid strata of the labour market. Manchester local authority turns out to have the smallest gender pay gap, again among residents in Manchester. So these sort of things need teasing out a little bit more, which we haven't got time to do here, but perhaps it's something we can open up for discussion. Now, of course, when we're talking about pay, one of the things that we're very, very interested in is poverty pay. So we're using this phrase poverty pay to talk about wages less than the living wage. And I mean the real living wage. I don't mean the sort of newly invented politicized living wage, which is just an increase on the national minimum, but only if you're over the age of 25 and all the rest of it. So let's put that to one side. So we're talking here about the living wage. And we're talking about the UK living wage, not the London living wage, of course. So if you look at the data for Greater Manchester, 1 in 4 employees, and that's all full-time and part-time, not self-employed. That's another discussion we should have. But just employees, 1 in 4, 23%, more or less 1 in 4, earned less than the UK living wage in 2014. So that's last year's living wage for which we have the earnings data. Of course, it's £7.85 now. That compares to a similarly high figure, but slightly lower, 21% for the UK. And as we know across the country, that figure's been growing and growing and growing. Why? Well, that's because the living wage has been going up at a faster pace than inflation, a significantly faster pace than average earnings, which of course have been falling in real terms for the last 10 years. So it's grown across the country from 18% to 21%, just in 2 years, from 2012 to 2014. It's also grown in Greater Manchester from 21% to 23% over that time. And remember, this is a time of so-called jobs recovery and economic recovery. But it's grown significantly in particular local authorities. The highest level in 2014 was Oldham, but the highest increases were seen in Rochdale, where it went from 18% to 24%, just in 2 years. That's a significant increase. And Stockport from, try to do this from memory, from 14% to 20%. That was the second highest increase. And these are fairly, relatively prosperous, given the, relative to the other Greater Manchester local authorities. So those are significant increases in a 2-year period. And again, that needs further examination. Now, it's in part-time work that you see the greatest share of employees in poverty pay. Across the country, the average share of women in part-time employees who earn less than living wage is 39%. In Greater Manchester, it's 43%, but in some local authorities, it reaches 50% and even higher. So this figure shows, if you see here, I can't move away from the microphone, you can see there, Oldham, the share of women in part-time jobs goes past 50%, so more than half. And it's pretty high in quite a significant number of those. So these are the kinds of things that really need tackling. And this isn't a story of low skill, low productivity. This is a story really of what employers can do, perhaps working in concert with other organisations, perhaps trade unions, as well as other voluntary sector organisations, to raise the value of many jobs within which many skills and tasks are simply rendered invisible, often because these are female-dominated jobs. So that, again, is a big area for discussion. Hopefully we can debate these issues. Now, one of the issues, of course, on the demand side is that we're not creating enough high value-added jobs. So there's issues about how you raise the profile and the value of so-called low value-added jobs, social care, cleaning, and so on, which almost by definition are low value-added because they're not valued by commissioning agents and so on and so forth. But the other issue is to do something more on the demand side. And we see that across local authorities, many local authorities aren't creating the types of management, technical, associate professional jobs that are needed to raise the occupational profile. And that's a major issue you can see, for example, in Salford there. For example, you've got a much higher share of sales and customer service jobs compared to the national average, right? So the bars going above the zero line are where there's more than the national average. Those going below is where there's less. The problem we see, though, in the labour market as it's currently structured is that there's really too much flexibility. I know we're not sort of allowed to say that the flexible labour market in Britain is a curse, but the type of flexible labour market we have at the moment is really a curse. There's too much. So we've developed other work aside from this project where we talk about C flexibility, because there's commodification, there's too much employer control rather than sort of jointly regulated control. And there's too much coercion in the labour market. We see lots of positive flexibility in other European countries where it's balanced with security, with representation, and with employee-led flexibility. So employee-led flexibility tends to give you good outcomes. The problem at the moment is that there's not enough incentives, as somebody already said, there's not enough incentives for employers to make the required and sustained investment. And many employers say this themselves. There is too much sort of available, cheap labour. There's not enough sort of push, there's not enough coalitions, there's not enough collective voice, even among employers themselves. So we know that there's underemployment of graduates. Greater Manchester doesn't do enough first to keep graduates in the locality, nor does it provide enough so-called graduate jobs, which provide the required pay and prospects, which are especially needed now to pay off debts and so on. There's also evidence that employers aren't offering training. Again, it's a problem of perverse incentives. There's too many sort of contradictory forces at play here. If you're using temporary agency work, or if you're using zero-hours contracts, or you're contracting with the self-employed rather than employees, you're not embedding in the sort of beneficial constraints, as some people call them, for investment in skills, training, and innovation, which, of course, would underpin better jobs. I shall leave it there, because there's many issues, hopefully, for discussion and debate, and we're hoping that we get plenty of time in this session. Thanks. So over to Ruth.